This is the Lew Rockwell Show.
Well, how great to have as our guest this morning Mr. Russ Baker. Russ is an actual investigative journalist, a title that's appended to many men and women's names, I would say illegitimately, but he actually does it. And his great achievement so far is the unbelievably researched and magnificent book, Family of Secrets, The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. So, Russ, before we get into what the Bush machine has done to America over these 50 years, if it bothers me to see George W. Bush going around promoting a book of lies, of course, this is a guy who's responsible for the death of maybe 1 million people, a lot of looting, lying, torturing. He's going around like some great guy, sweetheart guy, with his book. Many outrageous things in America today, but I must say that struck me as particularly outrageous.
Yes, I mean, the reaction to his new so-called memoir, Decision Points, is reminiscent of the larger American apathy and manipulation that I describe in Family of Secrets that has been going on for generations. You go all over the rest of the world, and they have a far different view, almost unanimous, about who Bush was and what he represented. But if you go on, let's say, Amazon, and you look at the reader reviews, first of all, his book is #1, day after day, ahead of everything. I mean, ahead of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and Twilight, and all the most popular fiction, nonfiction alike. It's always #1, which I have to wonder about. But there are these hundreds of adoring reviews from people who say, what a sensitive man, I didn't quite realize how great he was. This is terrific. What a candid memoir. It's staggering, and particularly staggering because if you think about the big issues, such as starting a war under false pretenses, I mean, what could be bigger than that? Or how about the man who started the war under false pretenses simply disappearing during a war himself where he was obligated to serve for a third of his time? None of this is dealt with any great length in his book. It's certainly not dealt with honestly, and yet these people don't seem to know or to care.
A subject of particular interest to me because he was such a drug warrior, isn't there some indication that Bush was himself a cocaine user?
Well, in Family of Secrets, and I'm very careful about that because there's so much rumor floating around on the Internet. I'm very careful about what I was able to establish. Certainly people I interviewed felt that the reason he left the cockpit, the reason that he dropped out of the Air National Guard had to do with some sort of substance abuse. That's what they were told by his commanding officer. And then on other issues, of course, he was a leader in the movement to deny women a choice over their bodies over abortion. And as I point out in Family of Secrets, there appears to have been at least one abortion and another situation involving women and himself.
Is Decision Point just one lie after another, or is there anything true in there? They claim that they've sold 1.2 million copies. I mean, can that actually be correct?
I don't know. They say that a lot of these numbers are manipulated, that these books by people like Bill O'Reilly and so on that are always right up at the top for a long period of time, that there are wealthy donors who fund mass purchases of these things. I don't know. There's no question that they're going to sell a lot because every bookstore has, even in the most sort of liberal parts of the country, have these huge displays of his books. Other authors can't get that kind of visibility. I mean, I could just speak personally about Family of Secrets. It's been a struggle to get any attention. We couldn't even get on all the, these kind of shows on MSNBC and Comedy Central that everybody assumed would just gravitate toward this material. The deck is really stacked, and in fact what we've done is relied on shows like yours and a kind of a grassroots campaign on the Internet to let people know that the book even exists. So, I don't know. I think a lot of people are picking up his book. What they're doing, the way I see his book, is that it's not so much that he cares about what people think of him, but that this is part of a deliberate effort to shape a kind of a strategic thing for the near and the long-term future, that the people behind his rise to the presidency are constantly in battle behind the scenes in Washington, inside and outside of the Obama administration, and now are moving their pieces on the board and getting ready to go back and take power again. And so we see Karl Rove orchestrating this American Crossroads, this vast amount of secretive money that came in and influenced the Republican takeover of the House of Representatives in November. We see Jeb Bush increasingly visible as a would-be possible contender for the presidency himself. So I think that that's what his book is for. And it's not that everything in there is a lie. What they do is they're very, very sneaky. And so he very cagily raises things like the allegations about his guard service, doesn't really talk about it, introduces no new things to defend himself really, but just basically mentions about how Dan Rather was brought down for supposedly putting up false information. And as you know from Family of Secrets, I show that that is not the case. He also, what he does is he has a lot of talking points in there. So, for example, there's a story about a fetus in a jar. His own mother on Larry King kind of hinted that that story may not have been quite right. But they put these things in there because they're trying to solidify their base, the hardcore of people in this country who so desperately want to believe in him and the values that he purports to represent. And so that's what they're doing. They're just solidifying the base.
Well, I remember when his father, who, of course, an aristocratic Connecticut Yankee, became a Texan, overnight for political purposes. And I can remember when he changed his views, long-held views on a whole bunch of topics in order to be able to be vice president, and then, of course, eventually president. And you indicate in your book that maybe, how should we say, Bush's religious conversion was not the most genuine one in history.
My research, and as you know, I spent 5 years researching Family of Secrets, and I have about 1,200 footnotes in there I think it's important to prove to people where the material came from. I was staggered to find the extent to which this family, and I'm talking about generations of it, has been disingenuous, and the extent to which they are either amoral or immoral. They simply don't care, and they're perfectly willing to fabricate things to tell people whatever they want to hear in order to get and keep power. And, this makes perfect sense because if you understand it's interesting, I saw that some of these WikiLeaks documents, the people in the U.S. government were portraying Putin and the Russian government as a kind of an oligarchy working with the security services, and I thought, well, that's an interesting term. I'm suspicious of concentrated power, period, and I think that we need a tremendous amount of vigilance and transparency. That's the reason I wrote Family of Secrets. That's why I'm trying so desperately to get this information out to people, just to understand that it's not necessarily, to me, the concepts themselves. It's the failure of the concepts to do what they say they're doing. And the thing about Bush and about his book and about the giant media machine in this country is that when on the surface, things are sort of true. In other words, Bush in the book says that Cheney was pushing him to invade Iraq. Now, it's entirely possible that particular conversation was true, that Cheney was sort of goading him to get his back up and to move a little bit faster. But what he leaves out is the bigger underlying story, which I reveal in Family of Secrets, was that Bush always wanted to invade Iraq. And as you know, I tell the story, never before told, from his own co-writer of a book from when he was running for president, how Bush was already telling him privately back in 1999 that if he got to be president, he wanted to invade Iraq. And so the problem that we face is that we cannot see the forest for the trees.
But this all began a long time ago. I mean, this began, if we look at just the role of the Bush family, it began even before Prescott Bush, the very influential and nefarious senator who was George W. Bush's grandfather, as you show in your book.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think that's one of the sub-themes of Family of Secrets is the extent to which this oligarchy has managed to manufacture a claimed national interest, which is nothing of the sort. I mean, this is one of the most brilliant cons in history, to convince people that they live in a kind of an idyllic wonderland of rights because they have a plethora of consumer products available to themselves. And as long as people don't pay any attention to the political system, and I traveled throughout Europe this summer, and people are much better informed, much more engaged. And there is more, there are many problems there, but they do have more transparency, and they have a wider range of options. That's the other thing that struck me, was that in Europe, these different political parties often have radically different proposed solutions. And then you look at the United States, and you see that there is so little difference between the Republicans and the Democrats in practice, if not in rhetoric, in terms of the fact that the same large, wealthy interests always end up benefiting, that the president's appointees, that Obama kept on Robert Gates. I go into him a bit in Family of Secrets, part of this Bush national security apparatus, that the same people connected to the same investment banks are in running the Treasury and the Fed and so forth. And so we do not see the nightmare that we are living in, and to me, this is so incredibly dangerous and getting more dangerous by the day. I'm interested to see how this WikiLeaks thing plays out. There are certainly some very good things about what they're doing and about the things they're releasing. As I say, I'm concerned about the lack of care and the lack of analysis and research done around documents themselves, and I'm afraid, because we know so little about this group, its origins, and who might have an interest in this kind of chaos, that what we could end up seeing is a war between these two extremes, and then another clampdown, even worse. And of course, based on this and these new attacks on MasterCard and what have you by the hackers, the response is going to be, and we already see it, saying, "Hey, we need to clamp down more." There's a new piece out by General Hayden, the former head of CIA and NSA, and he says this all goes to prove that it's Obama's fault. He's too permissive and too open. And you can see that this becomes an excuse for more authoritarian behavior.
And certainly Obama has simply continued Bush's policies, not only with Gates, but in the wars and in the police state. He's been no change at all. And of course, we're actually taught in our schools that it's a wonderful thing that America has a two-party system, unlike those chaotic Europeans. And it's a wonderful thing that the two parties are pretty much the same, because that brings stability. But of course, it brings stability for the oligarchy, not for the people.
Well, that's exactly right. And by the way, Lou, I just wrote a new blog post on, we have this nonprofit investigative reporting site, WhoWhatWhy.com. And I was struck, for example, that one of the WikiLeaks documents is a sort of embarrassing one about Vladimir Putin, and it describes him as, it says that he's running a kind of a corrupt government and an oligarchy that works with the security services, and then you see that he goes on Larry King, because and the New York Times writes an article and says, well, conveniently he went on Larry King, who only asks softball questions. And then I went to look to see if the New York Times had ever criticized Larry King before for asking American leaders softball questions. They never did. They had a short item in the Times about Larry King with Barbara Bush, and their own piece was softball. And so I then go ahead and I start asking all these questions about Barbara Bush and her husband. And as you know, in Family of Secrets, I have 4 chapters of all new information on the Kennedy assassination, on Watergate, and so on, and the linkage of all of these events with the covert security state and directly with George H.W. Bush himself and his secret life as a covert operative decades before he was director of the CIA. Now, what I ask in this blog post is, why is none of this covered in this country? It's all documented in this book. Pieces of it are documented elsewhere, and the U.S. media, corporate-owned media, simply acts like all of these earth-shattering things don't exist.
One of the most sickening things I've ever seen on Larry King, and I couldn't watch it all, was when he was interviewing, quote-unquote, George and Barbara Bush just recently, and had recorded statements by their children about how great they were. I must say it was the most sycophantic, horrible thing I think I've seen recently on television. Many things, of course, fit in that category. Did you see that show?
I didn't see it. I've only read the transcripts. The extraordinary thing is that all these shows did it. Oprah held hands on several occasions with George W. Bush. The thing on the Today Show was mostly extreme puffball. They focused on that fetus in the jar story. By the way, I think that was calculated. That got more media attention than anything else in the book, because the book is really a very dry and uninteresting read, and they needed something to get people's attention, and they did, and all these shows played along.
And as you say, right for a very long time, connected in a way that I guess it happens in most major states, where the oligarchy is connected to the security organs. Who else besides George H.W. Bush do you think in this family might actually be an active participant in the national security services?
The thing is that we're all being manipulated, and so you see that it's not the formal security services itself, it's the informal aspects. It's people inside there, the people like Alan Dulles, a close friend of the Bush family, who were these corporate lawyers who were involved in smuggling Nazi war criminals into the U.S., covering up the role of their own banks in bankrolling Hitler's rise and so forth. This is the real story, and so they manipulate the people themselves working inside these apparatuses who don't even know these things. This is the problem, and so you have to look at people outside the government to see their roles in the informal security state. And I would include people like Jeb Bush, who, they talk about him and his father as if they're more benign than the brother, but they're all exactly the same. Why was Jeb Bush even in Florida to begin with? Nobody even asked that. He was there because his father ran the Cuban exile community for covert operations. That is why the son was put in there as a princeling and hooked into a business with these wealthy, Cuban exiles, and made wealthy just like George W. Bush was made wealthy by the same kinds of people.
Very, very interesting. And this is the guy they want to have as the next president.
Well, that's right, and I think he's got a real shot at it. They also have Jeb's son now moving up. He moved back to Texas. This is what they do. They all, they identify a new colony, if you will, and just move over there and then start moving up with the connections and the family name. So I think we're going to hear a lot more from this family. And the people who dismissed my book, when Family of Secrets first came out, people said, who wants to read a book about the Bushes? They're gone. Who cares? Obama's in. It's a new day. And I said, not so fast.
Well, I can't recommend your book highly enough. I mean, it's such an extraordinary story. It's a horrible story, but it's a story we all need to learn about the actual facts of America and the way the American oligarchy and government operate. It's so well documented. It's really an amazing work. You ought to have any number of prizes for having put together this book. It shows the true nature. And I want to thank you on behalf of your readers, of whom there ought to be many more, for what you've done.
Lou, I appreciate it. This is an important program in that you do allow views to come out that may not be that welcome in the corporate-owned media, so you provide quite an important service.
Russ Baker, thanks so much for being on today. We'll link, of course, to your website and to your book, and keep it up.
Thank you very much, Lou.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to The Lew Rockwell Show, produced by LewRockwell.com. the best-read libertarian website in the world. If you'd like to advertise on this podcast or on the website, email advertising@LewRockwell.com. And thanks for listening.